The moment my future mother-in-law grabbed the microphone, standing center stage in front of over 500 guests, and coldly declared, "If the bride's family doesn't hand over 30% of Chen Industries shares as a dowry, this wedding is off right now," I distinctly heard the faint clink of my father's glass against the table. It was a tiny sound, so small that perhaps no one else in the dazzling, flower-filled ballroom even noticed it. The crystal chandeliers and wedding music were fading into silence, but to me, that sound felt like a knife slicing directly into my chest. My father, Mr. Robert Chen, the man who had single-handedly built Chen Industries from a small food processing plant in the city's outskirts, the man who had stood before hundreds of workers to resolve crises, who had never bowed to rivals many times his size. That man sat there, frozen, his eyes red-rimmed as he looked at me in my white wedding gown. I knew he wasn't afraid of losing money. 30% of Chen Industries shares were worth nearly $7 million. To my father, it was a part of his very being, his blood, sweat, and tears, but that wasn't what made him tremble. He was afraid for me. He feared his daughter would be humiliated on her own wedding day. He feared that if he simply said no, this entire room would look at me as a bride abandoned by the groom's family. As for me, Evelyn Chen, 29 years old, standing next to the man I once thought would be my husband, I felt my heart growing colder, little by little. Kevin Miller, my groom, still wore his white tuxedo, still had the small boutonniere pinned to his lapel, but his face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together. He wouldn't even look me in the eye. He didn't pull his mother away. He didn't say a single word to defend me. He just stood there silently, as if everything unfolding was exactly according to a script he'd known all along. The MC on stage awkwardly clutched his papers. The band had stopped playing. Whispers began to spread like wildfire across the tables. 30% of shares? A dowry? That's like forcing them to buy a groom. This groom's family is something else. I heard every single word, yet, strangely, I didn't cry. Perhaps my tears had died the moment Mrs. Patricia Miller, Kevin's mother, turned to my father with a triumphant smile and continued, "Mr. Chen, we're not asking for anything unreasonable. My son is well educated, has a respectable appearance, and comes from a reputable family. Evelyn will become part of our family. 30% of the shares are simply a guarantee for their future. If you love your daughter, you should sign it today, in front of both families, for transparency." She uttered the words, "love your daughter," so sweetly, yet her eyes were sharp as knives. Several relatives from the groom's side nodded in agreement. Kevin's sister, Tiffany Miller, sat at a front table, arms crossed, smirking as if she were watching a real estate negotiation, not her brother's wedding. As for my mother, if she was still alive, I'm certain she would have marched up and slapped Mrs. Miller. But Mom passed away when I was 17. Since then, Dad had been both father and mother, never letting me want for anything and never using money to buy my happiness. That's why, when Dad slowly rose to his feet, a chill ran down my spine. He picked up the pen Mrs. Miller had placed on the silver tray, next to a neatly clipped stack of share transfer documents, complete with the stamp of some law office. Everything had been prepared in advance. They weren't acting impulsively. They weren't angry. They had calculated this, cornering my father and me, where we couldn't refuse. Right in the city's most luxurious ballroom, in front of business partners, friends, relatives, and familiar corporate press. I looked at the pen in my father's hand, then at Kevin. All he needed to do was say one sentence. "Mom, stop this." Perhaps then I would have still offered him some last shred of respect. But he just bowed his head and whispered to me, "Evelyn, calm down. My mum just wants what's best for us." I let out a laugh, a very soft, dry laugh, but enough to make him flinch. Wants what's best? Forcing my father to hand over $7 million before the ring ceremony is what's best. Placing my honor on the negotiating table, bargaining with company shares, that's what's best. I suddenly remembered a year ago, the day I met Kevin at a distribution signing event in San Diego. He was then the sales director of a small partner company. Calm in his speech, a good listener, not as aggressive as many other men who had approached me. I didn't introduce myself as the president of Chen Industries' daughter. I just said I was in charge of product development. Kevin didn't overly pursue me. He invited me to eat street tacos at a casual stand, sheltered me from the rain with his worn-out jacket, and clumsily wiped a coffee stain from my sleeve with a napkin. These small things once made me believe that, in a city full of calculations, I had finally found someone genuine. After that, he persistently pursued me. On nights I worked late, he'd wait downstairs at the company with a hot bowl of soup. When my father was hospitalized for high blood pressure, Kevin was there for 3 days straight, quietly buying meals, getting medicine, and asking the doctors questions. Dad once told me, "Kevin seems kind, but don't judge people only by how they treat you." At the time, I just laughed and teased Dad for being too suspicious. I thought Dad had lived too long in the business world, seeing traps everywhere. I didn't know I was the one who was wrong. I didn't know that from the moment Kevin's family learned my father was the president of Chen Industries, everything had begun to change. Mrs. Miller, from a sweet-natured future mother-in-law, suddenly became overly interested in my family's assets. The first time she visited our house, she looked around the living room, at Dad's antique clock, at the lacquer painting my mother had left behind, then asked half jokingly, half seriously, "Such a big house. When Evelyn gets married, I'm sure your father will give her her own place, right?" I just smiled it off. When discussing the wedding, she suggested my family handle all the arrangements, saying that Chen Industries had extensive connections and it would be fitting for our status. When my father gifted us a condo in a chic part of Miami after the wedding, she clicked her tongue and said, "A condo is fine, but a young couple needs a decent car to get around. People will laugh if Mr. Chen's son-in-law drives an ordinary car." My father remained silent. I started to feel annoyed. Kevin would hold my hand and whisper, "Please understand, Evelyn. My mum worked hard all her life, so she thinks ahead." I had been understanding far too much. I was understanding when Mrs. Miller called me at midnight just to ask if I would be named on our shared assets with Kevin after the wedding. I was understanding when Tiffany subtly posted on Facebook that if you marry into a respectable family, your dowry should be commensurate. I was even understanding when, a week before the wedding, Mrs. Miller suggested Kevin be brought onto the board of directors of Chen Industries, claiming a son-in-law needed a respectable position. But this moment, when she turned our wedding into a public shakedown, all my understanding shattered. My father still stood there, the pen in his hand trembling slightly. I knew he was struggling. He loved me so much that he might accept the loss, as long as I wasn't humiliated in front of everyone. But that very love made my heart ache more than any insult could. I stepped down from the flower-covered platform, my wedding dress dragging across the red carpet. All eyes were on me. Kevin reached out to stop me, but I brushed his hand away. He froze. I walked straight to my father, gently took the pen from his hand, and placed it on the table. Dad looked at me, his voice hoarse. "Evelyn?" I squeezed his hand. For the first time that day, I felt tears sting my eyes, but I wouldn't allow myself to be weak. Not here. Not in front of these people who were waiting for my father and me to bow our heads. Mrs. Miller frowned. "What is the bride doing?" "The adults are talking." I turned to look at her, very slowly, very clearly. I saw in her eyes that disgusting self-confidence, as if she was sure I would swallow my humiliation for appearances, accept it for love, and let my father sign those papers for the sake of family reputation. She didn't understand me. She certainly didn't understand how my father had raised me. I was not the kind of woman who would spend her whole life trying to save a man who wouldn't protect her. I was not a commodity to be married off with shares, luxury cars, real estate, and fake blessings. I reached out and snatched the microphone from the MC's hand. A piercing feedback squeal blared through the speakers, making the entire ballroom jump and fall silent. I stood center stage, amidst the white baby's breath flowers, facing my future mother-in-law, facing the man who once said he loved me, facing hundreds of eyes waiting for a tragedy. My heart pounded, but my voice, when it came out, was surprisingly calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with the wedding ceremony, I have one thing to say." Mrs. Miller's face changed. She stepped forward, intending to grab the microphone back, but I took a step back, looking directly at her, then at Kevin. He was still bowing his head, still silent, and that silence was the final answer. I took a deep breath. Every memory from the past year flashed through my mind like a burning film reel. The fake dinners, the probing questions, the veiled requests wrapped in family affection, the times Dad frowned but still tolerated things for my sake. All of it led to this moment. I raised the microphone to my lips, looking at my father first, then sweeping my gaze across the ballroom. If today I have to spend $7 million to buy a marriage, I said, each word falling clear and cold, then that marriage isn't worth a single dime. The entire ballroom erupted. Whispers, chairs scraping, gasps, a chaotic din. Mrs. Miller stood frozen, her face turning from crimson to ashen white. Kevin looked at me, his eyes filled with panic. Tiffany jumped up from her chair yelling, "Are you insulting my family?" I turned to her with a faint smile. "No, I'm just returning your family to its true value." My father stood behind me, his heavy hand on my shoulder. I felt him tremble, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was the relief of a father who had just seen his daughter pull herself out of an abyss. I knew that statement was just the beginning, because on the phone in my hand were messages, loan documents, and recordings that the Miller family never wanted anyone to see. And if Mrs. Miller thought she could use this wedding to force my father and me to hand over shares, she was very, very wrong. Because from the moment I snatched that microphone, the one whose reputation would be ruined was no longer me, but their entire family. After I spoke those words in front of all the guests, the entire ballroom seemed to explode with discussions. But the story I'm about to tell doesn't begin on that wedding day. It began exactly 1 year before, on a rainy afternoon in San Diego, when I was still a woman who believed that true love could appear in the simplest of places. At that time, I was 28 years old, heading the product development department at Chen Industries. Although I was the president's only daughter, I never liked to flaunt my identity. From the moment I graduated college, I asked Dad to let me start as a regular employee. I commuted myself, handled the pressure, learned to sign contracts, and deal with difficult clients. In the eyes of many at the company, I was just Evelyn Chen, a capable young manager, not some rich heiress. Perhaps that's why I always hoped that one day I would meet someone who loved me for who I was, not for what stood behind the name Chen. That day, I was in San Diego for a food industry business networking conference. The program lasted 2 days. On the first afternoon after my presentation, it suddenly started to pour rain. I stood under the hotel awning with dozens of other people, calling for a taxi on my phone, but all cars reported being busy. As I fumbled, a black umbrella extended toward me. "If you don't mind, I can walk you to the conference area across the street." I looked up and saw Kevin Miller for the first time. He wore a light blue shirt and thin-rimmed glasses, with bright features and a very friendly smile. Since we were going in the same direction, we walked together under one umbrella. The road was only a few hundred yards long, but it was enough time for some small talk. I learned he was the sales director of a food company, looking for new distributors. He learned I was in charge of product development. That was it. No impressive introductions, no love at first sight. But his calm demeanor stuck with me. That evening, after the program ended, I went out for seafood with some colleagues. Coincidentally, Kevin was also there with his company's delegation at the restaurant next door. He recognized me first, smiled, and raised his glass in a distant toast. Things might have ended there if I hadn't accidentally left an important document folder in the conference room the next day. When I realized it, I went back to look for it and found Kevin waiting by the door. He held the folder in his hand. "I figured you'd come back for it," he said very naturally. I thanked him and offered to buy him a coffee. That was the first time we sat down to talk alone. For over an hour, he didn't ask me how much money I had, what my family did, or what they owned. He talked about his childhood in an old apartment complex in Chicago, about his independent years after college, about sales pressure, and his career setbacks. I noticed he was a very good listener. Whenever I spoke, he focused, didn't interrupt, and didn't try to prove he was smarter. That made me feel drawn to him. After the conference, he started texting me proactively. At first, it was just checking in about work, then longer conversations. Some nights, close to midnight, I'd still be at the office finalizing a new product launch plan. My phone would vibrate with a simple message. Had dinner yet? For some reason, these small gestures made a strong person like me feel cared for. 2 months later, Kevin expressed a desire to get serious, and I agreed. From then on, we officially began a relationship. The early days were truly beautiful. He would often wait for me after work so we could have dinner together. On weekends, we'd wander through small coffee shops, watch movies, or visit my father. What surprised me most was that Dad actually liked Kevin quite a bit. He wasn't easily trusting, and certainly not easily accepting of anyone entering his daughter's life. Yet Kevin always behaved very appropriately. One time, Dad had to be hospitalized due to a sudden spike in blood pressure. I was both worried and panicked. When he received my call, Kevin immediately left a meeting to rush to the hospital. For 3 days straight, he was there almost more than I was. He got medicine, bought food, and helped the nurses push the cart whenever Dad needed tests. Once, I stayed up all night caring for Dad, got so tired I dozed off in the chair. The next morning, I woke up to find Kevin's jacket on me, and he was sitting in the hallway, his eyes dark from lack of sleep. It was that moment that made me think I had found the man worth spending my life with. Dad even told me, if Kevin is as genuine as he seems, I'd be at peace. I just smiled, happy. But there was one thing I didn't realize. During all that time, Kevin knew almost nothing about my family's true wealth. He only knew my father owned a relatively large food company. For the actual scale, enterprise value, shares, or investment projects, I had never mentioned. I didn't intentionally hide it. I simply didn't want money to appear too early in our love story. Everything began to change one evening, about 6 months into our relationship. That day, Chen Industries held its anniversary celebration. I brought Kevin as my boyfriend. For the first time, he saw the true scale of the business my father had built. The ballroom was packed with partners, hundreds of guests, and leaders of major corporations congratulating us. When the MC introduced Mr. Robert Chen, president of Chen Industries, as one of the outstanding entrepreneurs in the American food industry, I saw Kevin's eyes change. It wasn't pride, it was astonishment mixed with something very hard to describe. That evening, on the way home, he asked me many questions. Is your dad's company really that big? How many branches does Chen Industries have? Will you inherit the company later? I thought it was just normal curiosity, so I answered vaguely. But from that day on, calls from his mother became more frequent. Mrs. Miller started inviting me to dinner at their house. At first, she was very enthusiastic, always calling me daughter, always putting food on my plate, always praising me for being well-behaved and capable. However, the longer I interacted with her, the more I felt a scrutinizing gaze behind those sweet words. She often asked about my father's work, the company's revenue, whether I owned shares, and who would run Chen Industries in the future. Once, during dinner, she suddenly asked, "Evelyn, your father must have a few $1 billion, right?" I laughed at her bluntness, but she watched intently for an answer, as if it were the most important thing at the table. When I changed the subject, I clearly saw a fleeting look of disappointment on her face. Looking back now, I understand that from that moment, in Mrs. Miller's eyes, I was no longer her son's girlfriend. I had become the gateway to a changed life, but at the time, I was completely unaware. I was still basking in the happiness of a girl about to be proposed to. I still believed those family dinners were genuine. I still believed Kevin was different from the pragmatic men out there. Even when my father, for a rare time, warned me, "You should thoroughly understand that family before going too far," I defended Kevin. I accused Dad of being too suspicious. I told him he saw self-interest and calculation everywhere. Dad just sighed and fell silent. That was the first time I saw an undefinable worry in his eyes. And it was also the first time I didn't understand why someone as experienced as my father saw something I completely missed. I didn't know that behind those warm dinners, sweet inquiries, and friendly smiles, a storm was quietly brewing. A storm that would sweep away everything I once believed, leading to this very day. The day the entire ballroom witnessed my future mother-in-law brazenly demand $7 million right at her own son's wedding. And the truth is, that was just the beginning. What I discovered later was far, far more horrifying. If the first 6 months of our relationship made me believe I'd met the right person, the next 3 months were like a layer of paint beginning to peel, revealing cracks I had deliberately ignored. After the Chen Industries anniversary celebration, where Kevin first witnessed the true scale of my family's business, everything changed, slowly and subtly. So much so that at first, I didn't even notice. The person who changed most obviously wasn't Kevin, but his mother, Mrs. Patricia Miller. Before that, she had only called occasionally to check in, but after that day, the frequency of contact increased significantly. Some days she would call me 2 or 3 times, asking about everything from work and life to future plans. If it had stopped there would be nothing to say. What started to annoy me was that almost every conversation eventually turned to money. One time, while having dinner at Kevin's house, Mrs. Miller suddenly asked, "Evelyn, when you get married, will your father share his company shares with you?" I paused slightly. That was my family's private matter and had never been discussed openly. Seeing my silence, she chuckled. "I only asked because you're the only daughter." I gave a vague answer and changed the subject, but her eyes at that moment made me uncomfortable. It wasn't the concern of a future mother-in-law. It was the gaze of someone calculating something. A few weeks later, Kevin took me to see a high-end condo in Brooklyn. I thought he wanted to scout a place for us to live after we got married, so I went along. However, when the real estate agent quoted a price of over $1,200,000, Kevin turned to me and smiled. "This place is nice, isn't it? After we get married, we should buy here." I laughed. "Buy with what? Are you planning to win the lottery?" Kevin laughed along, but then said something that stunned me. "Your dad is so rich, I'm sure he'd want his daughter to live in the best place." I stared at him for a few seconds. This was the first time he had mentioned my father's money so directly. He had never done that before. I tried to push the uncomfortable feeling aside, assuming he was just joking. But those kinds of jokes started appearing more and more frequently. One day he'd mention buying a Mercedes after the wedding. Another day he'd say that if he had a few tens of millions of dollars, he'd start his own company. Each time he'd end with, "I'm just kidding." But I started to realize that these so-called jokes always revolved around one single thing: money. Not long after, wedding arrangements were officially discussed between the two families. My father was a simple man. He always said marriage was about the two young people. The adults just supported them. So he proactively suggested a warm, intimate wedding, dignified but not ostentatious. I still clearly remember the first meeting between the two families at a restaurant in Los Angeles. At first, everything was quite pleasant. My father inquired about the health of Kevin's grandparents. Everyone raised a toast. Then Mrs. Miller suddenly said, "I think the wedding should be held at a 5-star hotel. After all, the bride's family has a social standing. Making it too small, people will laugh." My father smiled politely. "I think what's important is the children's happiness." Mrs. Miller shook her head. "No, Mr. Chen. A wedding is about the reputation of both families." The conversation continued to revolve around the cost of the event. What surprised me was that Mrs. Miller almost automatically assumed that all expenses should be covered by my family. She said very smoothly, "Money isn't important to us, but since your side is more financially established, it would be more convenient for you to take care of it." I looked at Kevin, waiting for him to speak up, but he just sat there quietly, drinking water. When we left, I asked him if he thought his mother was being a bit much. He immediately defended her. "My mum just wants everything to be perfect." I started to feel disappointed. However, I still told myself that wedding planning naturally leads to friction. Perhaps I was being too sensitive. Then something else happened. That day, my father called me into his study. He showed me a new investment plan for the company and asked for my opinion. In the middle of our conversation, he unexpectedly asked, "Are you sure you want to marry Kevin?" I was surprised. "Why do you ask, Dad?" He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "I have a feeling that family isn't as straightforward as they seem." I immediately retorted, "We've only met them a few times." He sighed. "Someone who's been in business for a long time can sometimes read a lot from just a glance." I didn't agree. At the time, I even thought Dad was being overly suspicious. Looking back now, I realized how naive I was. Because just 1 month after that conversation, the signs became clearer and clearer. Kevin's sister, Tiffany Miller, began to appear frequently at our gatherings. She always acted friendly toward me but constantly probed about my family's assets. Once, over coffee, Tiffany asked bluntly, "You're the sole heir, right?" I gave a strained laugh. "Why do you care about that?" She laughed loudly. "Just curious. Don't overthink it." But her eyes at that moment weren't curious at all. They were like someone assessing the value of a commodity. The climax came on my father's 58th birthday. Chen Industries hosted a small party with close partners. Kevin's family was also invited. While guests were chatting, I overheard Mrs. Miller talking proudly to an acquaintance. "My son is marrying the president of Chen Industries' daughter. He'll probably join the company's management later." The acquaintance asked if there were any plans yet. She smiled. "There will be. We're all family, after all." I stood a few yards away and felt a chill run down my spine, because Kevin and I had never discussed him joining my family's company. My father had never mentioned it. Yet, in Mrs. Miller's mind, it seemed to be a given. That evening I asked Kevin. He gave a forced laugh. "My mom just exaggerates things." I looked him straight in the eye. "Have you ever thought about joining Chen Industries?" He hesitated for a very brief second, then replied, "If there's an opportunity, that would be good, wouldn't it?" It was at that moment, for the first time in nearly a year of dating, that I felt a distance open between us, an invisible but very real chasm. I began to realize that the man in front of me was no longer the same man who had shielded me from the rain in San Diego that day. Or perhaps he had always been that way, and I was only now seeing it. Even so, I tried to salvage my belief. I told myself that everyone is influenced by their family sometimes. Everyone has their own ambitions. As long as Kevin genuinely loved me, everything could still be resolved. I had no idea that while I was still trying to protect this relationship elsewhere, the Miller family had already begun to calculate much more far-reaching steps. Steps that no longer stopped at a condo or a luxury car. Their goal now was something many times larger, and I was completely unaware that I was steadily approaching the trap set for my own wedding day. After my father's birthday party, the sense of unease within me was no longer a vague suspicion. It began to grow, like a thorn stuck in my throat, not painful enough to make me stop, but uncomfortable enough that I couldn't ignore it. What bothered me most wasn't Mrs. Miller's questions about money, or Tiffany's veiled hints. What kept me awake at night was Kevin's attitude. Every time I brought up something unusual from his family, he would try to explain, defend, or avoid the topic. Not once did he side with me. Not once did he say that his mother and sister had crossed the line. Some nights, lying alone in my apartment, I'd scroll through old photos, looking at the man who had stayed up all night with me at the hospital, and wonder who his true self really was. But love is a strange thing. When you're in love, you always try to find reasons to forgive rather than evidence to leave. I was no different. I still wanted to believe it was all just a misunderstanding. Until one day, I heard things with my own ears that I would probably never forget. It was a weekend afternoon. I arrived at Kevin's house earlier than planned because I wanted to give him some documents related to a new joint project. When I arrived, the gate wasn't locked. I walked into the yard and realized people were talking in the living room. Mrs. Miller's voice was very clear. Out of politeness, I intended to knock before entering. But just then, a sentence caught my ear, freezing me in my tracks. "If he can just marry that girl, our whole family's fortunes will change." I froze. The person who had just spoken was Mrs. Miller. A second later, Tiffany's voice rang out, full of excitement. "Don't worry, Mum. I think she's totally smitten with Kevin. You'll probably get whatever you want." A soft chuckle echoed from the living room. I felt a chill run through my entire body. Instinctively, I retreated behind the wall near the door and stood motionless. Part of me wanted to walk in immediately, but the other part wanted to keep listening, and that decision changed everything. Mrs. Miller continued, her voice full of calculation. "The important thing isn't the condo or the car. Those things aren't worth much. What I'm aiming for are the company shares. She's the only daughter. She'll inherit everything, sooner or later." Tiffany chuckled. "If Kevin can get onto the board of directors, our family will be set for life." "Not just the board, Mrs." Miller lowered her voice. but I still heard every word clearly. I've looked into it. Chen Industries is worth hundreds of millions now. If we can just get a piece of it, we won't have to worry for the rest of our lives. My heart pounded. I thought I had misheard. I thought they were just exaggerating. But then another voice spoke up. Kevin's voice. "Mom, don't talk so loud." It felt like someone had punched me in the chest. He knew he was there. He heard everything. And the only thing he cared about was his mother speaking softly, not opposing, not stopping. "Just don't let anyone else hear." Mrs. Miller laughed. "What are you scared of? Am I wrong?" Kevin was silent for a few seconds, then replied, "I just want things to go smoothly," Tiffany interjected. "You're too soft, bro. If it were me, I would have found a way to get my name into the company a long time ago." Another round of laughter. I stood outside, feeling as if all sound around me had vanished. Those words stabbed directly into my mind. It turned out everything Dad had worried about had a basis. It turned out I was the blind one. I don't remember how long I stood there, only that when I regained my composure, I quietly turned and left. No calls, no texts, no confrontation. I needed time to think. That evening, Kevin called me over 20 times. I didn't answer. He texted asking why I'd disappeared. I still didn't reply. Close to midnight, my phone vibrated again. It was my father. "Where are you, honey?" His voice was low but filled with worry. I involuntarily burst into tears. For the first time in years, I drove home in the middle of the night just to sit beside my father. We sat in the living room for a long time. I told him everything I had just heard. Dad wasn't surprised. That hurt me even more. He just quietly poured me a glass of water and said, "I don't want to interfere in your love life, but sometimes outsiders see things more clearly than those involved." My voice choked. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He gave a sad smile. "If I had, you would have thought I didn't like your boyfriend. Some lessons you only believe when you learn them yourself." I barely slept that night. Hundreds of memories of Kevin kept flashing through my mind. I remembered the time he drove in the rain to bring me soup at the office. I remembered the time he stayed up all night at the hospital. I remembered his nightly check-in texts. Was it all fake? I didn't want to believe it. But what I heard couldn't be fake either. Over the next week, I started observing more closely. For the first time, I looked at everything through the eyes of a sober person instead of a girl in love. And the more I observed, the more terrifying things I discovered. Kevin started mentioning company shares more frequently. He asked me if my father planned to divide management authority with me later on. He asked me what I thought about family members participating in business operations. He asked me how our joint assets would be managed if we got married. Before, I'd always answered casually. Now each of those questions sent a chill down my spine. One evening, while having dinner, he suddenly said, "I think it would be better if we worked together in the future." I asked him, "You mean at Chen Industries?" He nodded. "I have business experience, and besides, family members are easier to trust." I looked at him for a long time. What if my dad doesn't agree? He flinched, just for a second, but I clearly saw disappointment flash across his face. In that moment, a painful truth became clear to me. The man I loved wasn't just changing, he had changed a long time ago. Perhaps from the day he learned who I was, or perhaps that nature had always existed, only now did it have the opportunity to reveal itself. I began to discreetly check some information about Kevin's work. Not because I wanted to investigate him, I just wanted to find a reason to prove I had misunderstood. I wanted to see that behind his family's words, there was still a decent man. But the more I looked, the more I realized there were strange gaps in what he had told me. There were failed investments he had never mentioned. There were murky financial dealings. There were calls he always took outside whenever I appeared. My intuition began to sound alarm bells, and that was when I made the most important decision since I started dating Kevin. I would find out the whole truth myself, not to break up, not for revenge, but to know exactly who the man I was about to marry truly was. I had no idea that this decision would lead to a chain of events far more horrific than anything I could imagine, because what I was about to uncover was not just the greed of the Miller family, but also a financial secret powerful enough to destroy this entire marriage before it even began. From the day I decided to uncover the truth myself, my life entered a completely different phase. By day, I still went to work as usual, attending meetings, signing contracts, and laughing with colleagues as if nothing had happened. But every evening, returning to my apartment, as the city slowly submerged in the golden glow of streetlights and the sounds outside my window faded, I would sit in front of my computer, piecing together fragments of the life of the man I was about to marry. The most bitter part wasn't discovering he had deceived me. The most bitter part was that I still hoped I was wrong. I still hoped it was all just a misunderstanding. I still hoped I would find some evidence to prove Kevin was innocent and that his family was only a little greedy, not as wicked as I was beginning to think. Yet, the deeper I delved, the more chilling what appeared before me became. Initially, it was just minor details. A few personal loans registered with finance companies, some unusual transactions related to stock market investments. I even reassured myself that for someone in business, losses are normal. But then, one afternoon, an old college friend who worked in banking called me. After hearing me ask for some information about the company where Kevin worked, she remained silent for a long time, then unexpectedly asked, "Evelyn, are you really going to marry him?" My heart tightened. Is something wrong? The other end of the line remained silent for a few more seconds. I shouldn't be saying these things, but as a close friend, I think you need to know. Then she told me something that left me stunned. In the past year or so, Kevin had continuously co-signed for numerous personal loans, totaling close to $400,000. Some of these loans were overdue, and some were classified as high-risk debts. I couldn't believe my ears. The man who always appeared impeccably groomed and calm, who once told me he hated debt and always lived meticulously, was he really carrying such a massive amount of debt? I immediately tried to verify, and the more I checked, the more horrifying everything became. A few days later, through a connection in the investment world, I discovered Kevin had been involved in a stock speculation group. When the market surged, he made a lot of money. This fueled his ambition. Instead of stopping at the right time, he continued to borrow more capital to make larger investments. Then, the market crashed. All his accumulated savings evaporated in just a few months. But losing money wasn't the worst part. After that fall, Kevin plunged into another, even riskier investment channel: cryptocurrency. He continued to borrow, continued to gamble, continued to hope to recover what he had lost. The result was that he lost everything, not just his own money, but also money borrowed from banks, from friends, from partners, and from external sources that I didn't even dare to imagine. One evening, sitting alone in my office after work, I looked at the summary of debts that my acquaintance had just emailed me. The final number that appeared took my breath away, nearly $400,000. I read it over and over again. $400,000, not $10,000, not $100,000, but $400,000. My hands were cold, my head empty. I sat motionless for almost half an hour, not because the amount was too large for my family, but because throughout our entire relationship, Kevin had never said a single word to me about it. He let me plan our wedding, let me introduce him to my relatives, let my father trust him, while behind it all was a financial bomb that could explode at any moment. That night, I didn't go home. I drove around the city until almost 1 a.m. with only one question in my mind. Why? If he truly loved me, why didn't he tell me the truth? If he considered me the person he would spend his life with, why hide such a huge secret? 2 days later, I decided to meet Kevin. We met at a quiet coffee shop by Lake Tahoe. He arrived earlier than usual, still wearing his familiar smile when he saw me. But for the first time in almost a year of dating, my heart didn't flutter anymore. I placed a stack of documents on the table. "Explain this." Kevin looked down. In just a few seconds, all the color drained from his face. I had never seen him so panicked. He opened the folder, flipped through the pages, and his hands began to tremble. "Who gave you these?" I gave a bitter laugh. "You're concerned about who gave them to me, not why I know." Kevin was silent. The air between us was so heavy it was suffocating. Finally, he bowed his head. "When were you planning to tell me?" I asked. "After the wedding?" He didn't answer, and that silence was the clearest answer. A long moment later, he began to speak. Indeed, he had lost money due to investments. Indeed, he was nearly $400,000 in debt. Indeed, Many creditors were pressing him daily. As he spoke, his eyes reddened. I had once loved this man deeply, so a part of me still felt pain seeing him like this. But what I couldn't forgive was his next sentence. I hid it from you because I was afraid of losing you. I looked him straight in the eyes. No, you hid it from me because you wanted to marry me before I found out the truth. Kevin didn't refute it. I knew I was right. The conversation lasted over 2 hours. Sometimes he cried, sometimes he held my hand and pleaded. Sometimes he said he truly loved me and never intended to exploit me. But then I asked one question, just one question. Does your mother know about this? His face immediately hardened. That reaction alone was enough. I didn't need to hear the answer anymore, but eventually he nodded. Mom knows. My heart sank. Since when? Almost a year. I let out a laugh that was both painful and sarcastic. So the woman who called me daughter every day, who talked about loving me, who constantly brought up our future, knew perfectly well that her son was drowning in debt. It turned out all those suggestions about condos, luxury cars, shares, and positions in the company weren't simple greed. It was a plan to rescue the mountain of debt that threatened to sink their entire family. They didn't just want to change their lives, they needed money. A lot of money. When we parted that day, I sat in my car for a long time. I knew I should call off the wedding. I knew it was the right choice. But then the beautiful memories, the loving months, and the image of the man who had once cared for my father resurfaced. Finally, I decided to give Kevin one last chance, an opportunity to prove that his feelings were genuine. I made it clear to him that I would not tolerate any more deception. If he was hiding anything else, everything would be over. Kevin hugged me and cried. He promised to change. He promised to settle his debts. He promised to prove that he wasn't what I was thinking. That day, seeing the man I loved bow his head and apologize, I softened. I thought I was saving a relationship. I didn't know that this very decision was pushing me closer to the biggest shock of my life, because at that time, I still didn't know that the Miller family was preparing a much bolder plan. A plan not only to pay off the $400,000 debt, but to seize my family's assets, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, right on my wedding day. If anyone were to ask me what moment truly enlightened a woman after love, I wouldn't say it was discovering a lie, nor seeing the true face of the one she loved. It would be when she already knew the truth, had seen the dangerous signs, but still chose to give the other person another chance, only to realize they continued to betray her trust. After that coffee shop meeting, when Kevin admitted to the entire debt of nearly $400,000 and knelt to beg for my forgiveness, I struggled immensely. Some nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Some mornings I sat for hours in my office, unable to focus on work. My mind told me to stop, but my heart reminded me of the beautiful days we'd shared. Ultimately, I decided to give him one last chance. But at the same time, I quietly prepared for the worst-case scenario. I no longer trusted him completely. I began to save every message, every call, every document related to the unusual occurrences surrounding the Miller family. At the time, I just thought I was being cautious. I didn't realize that these very things would later become the weapons that would save my father's and my honor. The following weeks passed quite peacefully, at least on the surface. Kevin became much more compliant. He proactively updated me on his work, frequently texted to check in, and tried to regain my lost trust. Sometimes, looking at him, I genuinely wanted to believe he had changed. But every time I met Mrs. Miller or Tiffany, the uneasy feeling returned. They still maintained their outwardly warm demeanor, still called me daughter or future sister-in-law. But in my eyes, by then, it was all just a facade. What was strange was that, ever since I discovered Kevin's debt, Mrs. Miller almost never mentioned typical wedding gifts anymore. She didn't talk about cars, didn't mention condos, didn't bring up wedding expenses. Instead, she frequently hinted at being one family. Once during dinner, she looked at my father and chuckled, "After our families are joined, business matters should also support each other." My father just offered a polite smile. I remained silent, observing. Another time, she asked me directly, "Evelyn, how much of Chen Industries shares do you own?" I put down my fork, looked at her. "I've never cared about that." She smiled very quickly, but I still saw a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. As the wedding day approached, these questions appeared more and more often. Sometimes I started to wonder if this family truly saw me as a daughter-in-law or just as a key to unlock a door to wealth. About 3 weeks before the wedding, something happened that completely shattered my trust. That day, I went to Kevin's house to discuss the guest list. While waiting for him to come downstairs, I sat in the living room. Kevin's phone, forgotten on the table, lit up with a new message. I don't have a habit of checking other people's phones, but the content that appeared right on the lock screen froze me. The sender was saved as Mom. The message was just one sentence. Remember to ask about the shares before the wedding. Don't let it slip. I stared at those words. Each passing second made my heart grow colder. Just then, Kevin came downstairs. Seeing my gaze fixed on his phone, his face immediately turned pale. I picked up the phone and handed it to him. Explain this. He looked at the message and became so flustered that he couldn't speak coherently. Finally, he just uttered a familiar phrase. My mum just overthinks things. I laughed. Does your mum just overthink? Or is your whole family planning something? Kevin was silent, and that silence once again became the answer. That evening, for the first time in my life, I seriously considered calling off the wedding. I sat in my father's study until almost midnight. He didn't ask anything, just quietly listened to my story. After I finished, he looked at me for a long time and said, I will respect all your decisions. But there's one thing you must remember. Marriage is for life. Once you step into it, it's very hard to turn back. I knew he was worried about me, but I also knew he didn't want to force me. That made my heart ache even more. I didn't want to disappoint Dad. Didn't want him to witness his daughter's failure in love. Ultimately, after many days of thought, I decided to proceed with the wedding. But in my heart, I had set a final limit. If the Miller family crossed that line one more time, I would stop immediately. A week before the wedding, the groom's family unexpectedly requested a private meeting with my father. The reason given was to discuss a few more details related to the wedding ceremony. The meeting took place at a lavish restaurant. Kevin and I were both present. At first, everything proceeded normally. Then Mrs. Miller suddenly said, I think after the wedding, Kevin should be involved in managing a part of Chen Industries. He is family, after all. The atmosphere at the table immediately changed. My father gently placed his teacup down. Company matters must be based on competence and procedure. Mrs. Miller still smiled. I understand, but if he's the son-in-law, he should have a respectable position. I looked at Kevin. He bowed his head. Once again, he let his mother speak for him. Once again, he didn't object. When we left, I knew the matter wasn't over, and just as my intuition told me, only a few days later, the real blow came. It was the evening, exactly 3 days before the wedding. I received a call from a friend who worked at a law firm. He sent me a draft of a share transfer agreement that had already been prepared. The person who requested the consultation was Mrs. Patricia Miller. I opened the file, and my entire body stiffened. The content clearly stated the transfer of 30% of Chen Industries shares to a new legal entity controlled by Kevin. I read it over and over, unable to believe it. They weren't aiming for a few $100,000 anymore. They were aiming for nearly $7 million. I immediately called Kevin. He didn't answer. I called continuously more than 10 times. It was on the 11th call that he finally picked up. His voice trembled. I was going to tell you. I laughed. I've heard that line too many times. You were going to tell me after everything was done, right? Kevin was silent. I asked him directly. Your mother wants 30% of Chen Industries shares. He didn't deny it. I felt my heart being squeezed. That was the last moment I still had hope, and that hope had just died. But what shocked me most wasn't that the plan existed, but that they had prepared an even bolder move. The next morning, through a recording I accidentally obtained, I heard Mrs. Miller herself telling a relative that if the bride's family refused to transfer the shares, she would force them to do it right at the wedding, in front of all the guests. No one wants to lose face on their wedding day. They'll be forced to concede. When I heard that, I was speechless. It turned out they had planned this for a very long time. It turned out the wedding was no longer a happy day. It had become a meticulously calculated bargain. And from that moment on, I made my final decision. I would not cancel the wedding beforehand. I would let everything unfold exactly as they wished. I would let them step onto the stage themselves, expose their true faces in front of everyone. Because sometimes, the way to make a greedy person pay the highest price isn't to stop them, but to let them believe they are about to win, and then watch everything collapse right before their eyes. And I had no idea that just 3 days later, in the city's most luxurious wedding ballroom, that plan would turn into a battle that would forever prevent the Miller family from ever holding their heads high again. My wedding day finally arrived, but from the moment I woke up that morning, I knew this wouldn't be the beginning of a marriage. This would be the end of a drama that had lasted nearly a year. Unlike the usual nervousness of brides, I felt strangely calm. Perhaps because after everything I knew, after all the evidence I held on my phone, I had nothing left to fear. The only thing that saddened me was my father. In the days leading up to the wedding, he still tried to act normal, still asked how I was eating, how I was sleeping, still checked every small detail of the ceremony, like a father preparing to give his daughter away to the man she loved. But I knew he had a premonition. He just hoped, as I once hoped, that things wouldn't be that bad. The hotel where the wedding was held was one of the most luxurious venues in Los Angeles. The ballroom was adorned with tens of thousands of white flowers. Sparkling crystal chandeliers stretched from the stage to the back of the room. Over 500 guests were present, including relatives from both sides, my father's business partners, friends, and acquaintances from the corporate world. From the outside, this was a perfect wedding. A beautiful bride, a dashing groom, two perfectly matched families. No one knew that beneath that glamorous veneer, a bomb was just waiting to explode. As I walked into the ballroom, to the sound of wedding music, the eyes of hundreds of people turned toward me. I saw my father sitting in the front row. He smiled at me. That smile pierced my heart. I promised myself that no matter what happened today, I would not let anyone insult him again. The ceremony began smoothly. The MC led the program with familiar well wishes. Guests raised their glasses. Laughter and chatter filled the ballroom. Kevin stood beside me, his face more strained than usual, but still trying to maintain his composure. I knew he was waiting for something. So was I. And then, that moment finally arrived. As the MC began, "Now, please welcome the bride and groom for the ring exchange ceremony." A voice suddenly rang out from the front row. "Wait!" The entire ballroom immediately turned around. The person who had just stood up was Mrs. Patricia Miller. She wore an expensive, deep red evening gown, adorned with dazzling gold jewelry, and walked slowly toward the stage. On her lips was still that familiar smile, but this time I no longer saw hypocrisy. I saw greed, a raw and terrifying greed. The MC, flustered, handed her the microphone. Mrs. Miller took it and turned to all the guests. Before these two officially become husband and wife, I believe there's something that needs to be clarified. The entire ballroom began to murmur. I stood still. My father sat motionless. Kevin bowed his head. Everything was unfolding exactly as I had predicted. Mrs. Miller continued, her voice full of confidence. "My family has always treated Evelyn like our own daughter, but a wedding is for life. We need a guarantee for the future of these two." A few whispers arose from the tables. I saw many people starting to look confused. Mrs. Miller took a breath and then said what she had prepared for a very long time. I proposed that Mr. Chen transfer 30% of Chen Industries shares to my son as a dowry. The entire ballroom seemed to freeze. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. No one believed what they had just heard. Then murmurs erupted like waves. Some people's eyes widened, some gasped, some turned to look at each other as if they had just witnessed the most absurd thing in their lives. But Mrs. Miller still stood there, calmly, as if she had just made a perfectly reasonable request. If we are to be one family, our assets should also be connected. We don't want our son to be at a disadvantage later. I looked at my father. That was the moment that hurt me most. He wasn't angry, not enraged, just sitting there quietly with eyes full of hurt. Perhaps he couldn't believe that someone could turn his daughter's wedding into such a public shakedown. But what hurt me even more was Kevin's reaction. He stood right next to me. He heard everything, and he didn't say a word. No objection, no intervention, no protection for me, just silence. That silence killed the last lingering feelings I had for him. Mrs. Miller continued her attack. I've already prepared the documents. Mr. Chen just needs to sign, and everything will be perfect." A man from the audience walked up, carrying a folder. I recognized it as the contract I had seen before. They had truly prepared everything. Not a moment of impulsiveness, not words spoken in anger. This was a plan that had been calculated for a very long time. The entire ballroom was now almost in chaos. My father's partners looked at each other in disbelief. Some shook their heads, some started pulling out their phones to record. Mrs. Miller still didn't seem to realize she was destroying her own image. She turned to my father. "Mr. Chen, if you truly love your daughter, now is the time to show your sincerity." I saw my father's hand tremble as he took the pen offered to him. Not because he regretted the shares, I understood him better than anyone. He was afraid I would be hurt. He was afraid that if he refused right now, the entire wedding would collapse in front of hundreds of people. He was afraid I would bear the shame that didn't belong to me. It was his love that made him hesitate, and that's precisely why I couldn't remain silent any longer. I stepped forward, gently taking the pen from my father's hand. The ballroom immediately fell silent. Mrs. Miller frowned. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer. I placed the pen on the table and then turned and walked toward the MC. Before anyone could react, I snatched the microphone from his hand. A piercing squeal echoed through the ballroom, hundreds of eyes fixed on me. The atmosphere was thick, suffocating. I looked directly at Kevin. His face was pale. I looked at Mrs. Miller. The smile had vanished from her lips. I looked at Dad. He was standing behind me, his eyes a mix of worry and pride. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. I raised the microphone to my lips. The entire ballroom held its breath, and then I spoke, each word so clear that perhaps the Miller family would never forget them for the rest of their lives. If today I have to spend $7 million to buy a marriage, I paused for a few seconds. Everyone stared at me, unblinking. Then that marriage isn't worth a single dime. A sharp gasp came from somewhere in the audience. Immediately after, a flurry of intense whispers. Mrs. Miller's face turned from red to ashen white. Kevin stood frozen, and I, for the first time after months of doubt and disappointment, felt a wave of relief. But that was just the beginning, because what I was about to publicly reveal next was truly a nightmare for the Miller family. And in just a few more minutes, their entire true colors, which they had tried to hide for so long, would be exposed before hundreds of witnesses, right in the middle of the very wedding they intended to use to subjugate my father and me. The moment my words echoed through the ballroom, time seemed to stand still for a few brief seconds. Over 500 guests sat motionless, looking from me to Mrs. Miller, then back to Kevin, as if no one could believe what was unfolding before their eyes. If this were a movie, that would be the climax. But for me, it was only the opening act of the truth. I still held the microphone, standing center stage amidst the white flowers. Below, curious, astonished, confused, and even sympathetic eyes were directed at me. Mrs. Miller was the first to regain her composure. She pointed at me, her voice trembling with anger. "What game are you playing? This is your wedding day." I looked at her, for the first time feeling no respect whatsoever for the woman in front of me. "Yes, today is my wedding day, but you are the one who turned it into an auction." The entire ballroom immediately erupted into whispers. Mrs. Miller's face flushed crimson. "Watch your words, young lady." I laughed. The one who needs to watch their words isn't me. After saying that, I turned to the technical crew standing near the stage. Before the ceremony began, I had quietly prepared everything. I knew this moment would come. I just didn't know how greedy they would be. It turned out I had still underestimated them. "Please connect the projector for me." The entire ballroom looked bewildered. A few members of the technical team exchanged glances, then looked at me. One person recognized that I was the bride and immediately complied. Just a few seconds later, the giant LED screen behind the stage lit up. Mrs. Miller truly began to lose her composure. "What are you planning to do?" I didn't answer. The first image to appear on the screen was a summary of outstanding debts under the name Kevin Miller. Immediately, the entire ballroom gasped. The numbers were clearly displayed, line by line. Bank loans, unsecured loans, stock investment loans, personal loans, a total of nearly $400,000. Kevin's face was ashen, like someone who had lost all blood. I looked at him. "Do you want to explain yourself, or should I?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Mrs. Miller immediately rushed to the front of the stage. "This is private. You have no right," I cut her off. "So you have the right to force my father to hand over $7 million in front of 500 people?" The entire audience immediately fell silent. No one was defending Mrs. Miller anymore. I continued to click the remote. The second page displayed messages between Mrs. Miller and Kevin. Not just one message, not two, but dozens of conversations spanning many months. "Must get the shares, we'll deal with the rest after the wedding. Their family is so rich, it would be a waste not to take it. Don't let the girl find out." Each line that appeared was like a slap to the face of the moral facade the Miller family had painstakingly built over time. The whispers began to turn into open discussions. A few elderly people shook their heads in dismay. Some of my father's business partners looked at each other in disbelief. I saw some even get up and leave, unwilling to witness such shame any longer. But I wasn't stopping. I had been silent for too long. Today was the day everything had to be exposed. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice clear. "I learned about Kevin's nearly $400,000 debt a month ago. I confronted him. I gave him a chance. I hoped he was sincere." I looked at Kevin. He was bowing his head, not daring to look at me. But instead of rectifying his mistakes, his family thought of a way to take money from my family. Mrs. Miller shrieked, "You're slandering us!" I turned to the screen. An audio recording played. Mrs. Miller's voice echoed clearly through the speakers. "If the bride's family doesn't agree, then force them at the wedding. With so many people there, they won't dare refuse." The entire ballroom erupted. Some gasped in astonishment. Some covered their mouths. Some sprang to their feet. Even the MC was frozen. I looked directly at Mrs. Miller. This time, she couldn't speak. Her face was chalk white, her lips trembling continuously. But the real shock had not yet arrived. Because just then, from the back of the ballroom, a man's voice suddenly rang out. "I believe Miss Chen hasn't finished speaking yet." Everyone simultaneously turned around. A middle-aged man in a dark suit was standing up from a guest table. I recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Thomas, the director of a major bank branch and a longtime partner of Chen Industries. He slowly walked forward. "My apologies for appearing at an inappropriate time, but I think everyone should know a few more things." The atmosphere in the ballroom immediately grew tense. Mr. Thomas looked at Kevin, then spoke slowly. "The nearly $400,000 in debt that Miss Chen just mentioned is only the tip of the iceberg." I saw Kevin's face immediately contort. Mrs. Miller also flinched, looking at Mr. Thomas. He continued, "Kevin Miller is currently on a list of clients at risk of civil litigation for multiple overdue loans." A wave of murmuring erupted, more intensely than before. I looked at Kevin. This was the first time I had seen him truly panic. But it wasn't over yet. Another person suddenly stood up from a guest table on the right side of the ballroom. He was a man in his 50s, tougher looking than the other guests. He took a few steps forward and pointed directly at Kevin. "He still owes me $150,000. The entire ballroom froze. No one had time to understand what was happening before another person stood up. "He owes me $80,000. Then another, "I'm owed $40,000. Another, "I'm owed $30,000. In less than a minute, 5 different people had stood up, claiming to be Kevin's creditors. The noise in the ballroom now resembled a chaotic marketplace. No one cared that this was a wedding anymore. Everyone was solely focused on the Miller family, who were slowly revealing their true selves. I stood silently on the stage. Although I knew much, even I hadn't realized the situation was this serious. Kevin didn't just owe $400,000. He had borrowed money from everywhere, through every possible means. What shocked me most were the words of the last man who stood up. He looked directly at Mrs. Miller and said loudly, "This family borrowed money by boasting that they were about to become in-laws with the president of Chen Industries, saying that after the wedding, they would have the company's shares as backing." The entire ballroom exploded for a second time. I distinctly heard many people gasp loudly. A few guests started calling someone on their phones. Some recorded videos, some stood completely up from their seats. My father still sat in the front row, but this time he was no longer heartbroken. His eyes were cold, very cold. It was the gaze of a businessman who had just seen someone exploit his family's honor for personal gain. I knew the real storm had begun, and the Miller family still didn't understand that the most horrifying thing was yet to come. Because just then, in the chaotic ballroom, a completely unexpected presence was approaching the main entrance. Someone, Mrs. Miller, surely never wanted to see on this day. If the previous part was when the Miller family's masks began to fall, then what followed was the moment their entire true faces were exposed before hundreds of people. The ballroom had completely lost the atmosphere of a wedding. The music had long since faded, and no one touched the glasses on the tables anymore. Over 500 guests sat motionless, as if witnessing a real-life courtroom drama. The continuous accusations from the creditors had stripped Mrs. Miller of her initial arrogance. Her face turned deathly pale, her lips trembling incessantly. Kevin stood beside me like a lost soul, while Tiffany kept looking from her mother to her brother, her eyes so panicked she almost burst into tears. But what surprised me most was how incredibly calm my father remained. He sat in the front row, hands clasped, his eyes sharp and observing everything. Anyone who knew him knew that the calmer he was, the angrier he truly was. And I knew this anger wasn't about money. $7 million or even hundreds of millions, my father could always earn back. What he couldn't accept was someone exploiting his daughter's affections to orchestrate a scheme to seize his assets. A scheme that had lasted for nearly a year. The murmuring still echoed throughout the ballroom when the large doors at the far end unexpectedly opened. Everyone simultaneously turned to look. 3 men in dark suits walked in, accompanied by a middle-aged woman in her 50s. The moment Mrs. Miller saw her, her face immediately changed. It was no longer anger or shame. It was genuine fear. A fear I had never seen on her face before. The woman walked straight forward, stopping a few yards from the stage, then stared intently at Mrs. Miller. The atmosphere in the ballroom immediately became suffocating. I recognized her. It was Miss Sarah Hamilton, the owner of a food supply company in Seattle and a former partner of Chen Industries. Years ago, I had met her a few times at industry conferences, but I didn't understand why she was here until she spoke. "Well, Mrs. Miller, we finally meet again." That brief statement silenced the entire ballroom. Mrs. Miller recoiled half a step. "What are you doing here, Miss?" Hamilton gave a faint, bitter laugh. "I'm here to reclaim justice." After saying that, she turned to address all the guests. "Perhaps many of you here don't know, but 2 years ago this family did something similar to mine." The entire audience immediately buzzed with whispers. I felt my heart pound. A very bad premonition arose. Miss Hamilton continued, "My son was once engaged to Mrs. Miller's niece. During that time, Mrs. Miller repeatedly used the guise of family connections to secure business loans. When the scheme unraveled, they completely disavowed any responsibility. I saw a few guests beginning to exchange looks of utter astonishment. Miss Hamilton took a folder from her handbag and held it up. I filed a lawsuit, but then they kept stalling, negotiating, and dragging things out until today. Mrs. Miller immediately shrieked, "You're slandering me!" But her voice no longer held any weight. Because just then, one of the men accompanying Miss Hamilton stepped forward. He introduced himself as a lawyer, then opened a file and read a series of documents related to loans, commitment letters, and messages exchanged between the two parties. Each document presented made the Miller family's faces turn a little paler. I stood speechless on the stage. It turned out what I knew was only a very small part. It turned out this wasn't the first time they had used marriage as a tool to access other people's assets. But the biggest shock was yet to come. While everyone was still discussing furiously, my father slowly stood up. The ballroom immediately fell silent. He walked onto the stage and stood beside me. That simple action alone almost made me burst into tears. From the beginning, he hadn't interfered, hadn't defended me with words. He had let me handle everything myself. But now, with almost all the truth exposed, He stepped up to stand beside his daughter, and that meant more than any words. My father took the microphone. His voice was deep and calm. There's something I haven't mentioned until now. The entire ballroom listened intently. He looked straight at Mrs. Miller. About 4 months ago, I hired an independent investigation firm. A wave of astonishment immediately swept through the audience. Even I was startled. Dad had never told me this, he continued. Initially, I just wanted to thoroughly understand the family who was about to become our in-laws. Mrs. Miller began to visibly tremble. You have no right. My father cut her off. But what I received far exceeded my imagination. He nodded toward a man standing near the stage. That man immediately handed a storage device to the technical crew. Just a few seconds later, the LED screen behind lit up again. The new images displayed were investigative documents, copies of transactions, audio recordings, and then one document that made the entire ballroom erupt. A loan application with my father's signature, but it was a forgery. I recognized it immediately. I had seen his signature for over 20 years. My father looked directly at Mrs. Miller. Do you care to explain why this document exists? Mrs. Miller's face was as white as a sheet, completely drained of color. Tiffany burst into tears. Kevin stumbled and sank into a chair. My father continued. According to the investigation, this document was used to approach several credit institutions to secure loans under the pretense of being associated with Chen Industries. The murmuring immediately erupted more violently than all previous times combined. Some guests sprang to their feet. Many couldn't believe their ears, because this was no longer just about greed. This was behavior that showed signs of violating the law. I looked at Mrs. Miller. The woman who had once held her head high and demanded $7 million in front of hundreds of people could no longer stand steadily. But what made her completely collapse was when the ballroom doors opened again. This time, 3 people in official uniforms walked in. No one needed an introduction to know who they were. The entire audience immediately held its breath. The person leading the group walked directly up to Mrs. Miller and calmly presented some documents. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw Mrs. Miller's knees buckle. Tiffany's cries rang out. Kevin buried his face in his hands, motionless, and I stood there, center stage, originally decorated for a wedding, watching it all like a bizarre dream. 1 year of love, 1 year of hope, 1 year of trust, finally ended in a way no one could have predicted. But deep down, I knew it wasn't truly over yet. Because after the truth was exposed, what remained was not just the collapse of the Miller family, but also my journey to emerge from those ruins, find myself again, and start a completely new life. A year after the ruined wedding, there are still times I wonder what my life would be like if I had remained silent that day. Perhaps I would have become Kevin's wife. Perhaps I would have lived in a marriage full of deception. Perhaps my father would have lost a part of the fortune he built with his youth. And perhaps I would have spent many years regretting my soft-heartedness. But life doesn't have what-ifs. The only thing I know is that when I walked out of that ballroom that day, taking off my wedding dress before even exchanging rings, I closed the most painful chapter of my life. In the first few days after the incident, social media practically exploded. The video clip of Mrs. Miller demanding 30% of the shares right in the middle of the wedding went viral at lightning speed. In just a few days, it garnered millions of views. People argued, commented, criticized, and discussed it everywhere. At first, I was exhausted. I didn't want to be the main character of any online story. But then I realized that some truths cannot be hidden forever. What happened that day wasn't my fault. I was not the one who should be ashamed. So I decided to stop hiding. I returned to work after a week's break. The first thing I did was go to the company to see my father. That day, he was at the newly built factory in Texas, inspecting the production line. Seeing me walk in, he just offered a very faint smile. He didn't ask if I was sad, didn't ask if I regretted anything, just said one sentence. My daughter has grown up. I had tried to be strong for many months, hadn't cried at the wedding, hadn't cried when exposing the man I once loved. But the moment I heard that sentence, my tears fell. Perhaps it was because, finally, everything was truly over. In the months that followed, the investigation related to the Miller family continued. The results were far worse than what had emerged at the wedding. Many questionable loans were discovered, some documents showed signs of forgery, and some unusual financial transactions were also brought to light. I no longer followed it too closely. It was no longer my life. But occasionally, I would hear news from acquaintances. Mrs. Miller, who always loved to appear in luxurious places, boasting about her connections and status, had now almost disappeared from all social gatherings. Those who once praised her also gradually avoided her. I didn't feel gloating. I just felt that everything happened according to life's rules. When greed crosses a line, the price to pay is always very high. As for Kevin, the man I once thought I would spend my life with, he completely vanished from my life. About 3 months after the wedding, he tried to contact me one last time. That day, I was working when I received an email. The content wasn't long. He apologized. He said he had lost the most precious thing in his life. He said if he could go back, he would choose differently. I read it, then closed it. I didn't reply, not out of hatred, but because everything was truly over. Some mistakes can be corrected, but some mistakes can only be accepted along with their consequences. I no longer resented him, nor did I still love him. The only thing that remained was a very expensive lesson about trust. My life then gradually returned to its normal course. I dedicated most of my time to work. Chen Industries entered a new expansion phase with many large projects. Dad began to entrust me with more responsibilities. From managing one department, I gradually became involved in the strategic decisions of the company. The pressure was immense. Some days I worked until midnight. Some business trips lasted weeks, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt at peace. I no longer had to guess who was sincere, who was deceitful, no longer had to worry about toxic relationships. I learned to love my own life before thinking about loving someone else. One afternoon, almost a year after the wedding, I attended a business conference in San Diego with my father. That city reminded me of the first time I met Kevin, but the pain from before was gone, replaced by only a distant nostalgia. After the conference, I went to dinner with a few friends. Among them was a man named David Harrison, the CEO of a food technology company. We had met a few times for work but had never talked extensively one-on-one. That day, after almost everyone had left, I still sat on the rooftop, looking at the night ocean. He brought me a hot cup of tea and sat down beside me. He didn't ask about my assets, didn't ask about the company, didn't ask what had happened before. He just asked a very simple question. Have you been getting enough sleep lately? I laughed. Perhaps it was because it had been so long since someone cared about me as a normal person, not a family name, a fortune, or a position in a company. We didn't fall in love immediately, like in movies. Everything happened very slowly, very naturally, and what I cherished most was that he never tried to curry favor with my father, never asked about shares or inheritance. What he cared about were my feelings. That seemingly simple thing. A year after the cancelled wedding, I returned to that same hotel for the company's anniversary celebration. As I walked past the old ballroom, I paused for a few seconds. The place that had witnessed one of the most chaotic days of my life still sparkled. The light shone as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there, then smiled. Not a smile of victory, nor a smile of revenge, but the smile of someone who had finally moved past the past. I understood that life is sometimes fair in its own way. Good people don't always get lucky, but if you're astute enough to protect your values, you won't regret it in the end. And those who try to build happiness on deception and greed will, sooner or later, pay the price. Even today, whenever I recall the day I snatched the microphone in the middle of the wedding and declared that a marriage isn't worth a single dime if you have to buy it with $7 million, I have no regrets. Because that was the moment I chose self-respect over tolerance, truth over illusion, and most importantly, chose to protect the father who had spent his entire life protecting me. If my story makes you think about love, marriage, and greed in life, remember that a person's worth lies not in the assets they carry, but in how they treat those who love them. And if you enjoy emotional real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the Daily Life Stories channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the latest stories. Also, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. What would you have done if you were Evelyn that day? Chosen silence to save face, or stood up and exposed everything as I did? We look forward to reading your thoughts. See you in the next story.